What if I told you the Pacific Northwest was almost home to a city as iconic as New York or San Francisco, but at the mouth of the Columbia River instead of Seattle or Portland? That's not just a what if. It was a plan. So, why didn't it happen? The answer involves treacherous waters, shifting sands, railroads, and even a devastating fire. Let's dive into the untold story of Astoria, Oregon, the city that never got its chance to shine. In the early 1800s, the mouth of the Columbia River seemed like the ideal spot for a major city. Think about it. A natural waterway leading into the heart of the Pacific Northwest, endless forests for building materials, fertile lands nearby, and easy access to the Pacific Ocean for trade. If you squint, it almost feels like San Francisco. But there was one big difference. While San Francisco's Golden Gate offered a calm, protected entrance to its harbor, the Columbia River Bar was a death trap. This infamous sandbar, formed by the river's powerful currents dumping sediment into the ocean, created chaotic and unpredictable conditions. Waves could rise without warning, and the currents would churn violently, constantly shifting the underwater sand. The area became known as the Graveyard of the Pacific, and for good reason. Nearly 2,000 ships met their end there. Still, the United States was determined to stake its claim in the Pacific Northwest, and Astoria became the first American settlement on the West Coast. Astoria was founded in 1811 by John Jacob Astor, an ambitious fur trader who dreamed of building a global trading empire. His Pacific Fur Company set up shop at the mouth of the Columbia River, hoping to dominate the fur trade and use the location as a gateway to the Pacific markets. With its access to inland trapping regions and the vast Columbia River, the settlement had everything it needed to succeed, or so it seemed. But Astor's dream faced significant challenges. The area's harsh weather and rugged terrain made life difficult, and the settlement struggled to grow. Meanwhile, the British Hudson's Bay Company established Fort Vancouver further upriver in 1825. The British weren't just looking to trade. They wanted to solidify their claim to the Pacific Northwest. Fort Vancouver quickly overshadowed Astoria, becoming the center of trade and governance in the region. Astoria was also caught in the crossfire of geopolitical struggles. During the War of 1812, the British seized the settlement, renaming it Fort George. Although it was later returned to the United States, its moment in the spotlight had already passed. Fast forward to the late 1800s, and the story of Astoria takes another turn. By this time, railroads were revolutionizing America, connecting major cities to the economic heart of the country in places like New York and Chicago. For any city to thrive, it needed a rail connection. Astoria seemed like a natural candidate. Its location at the mouth of the Columbia River should have made it a prime terminus for westward expansion. But the rugged coastal range stood in the way. Building a railroad through the steep, forested mountains would have been expensive and challenging. So, the Northern Pacific Railway made a different choice. Instead of extending the line to Astoria, they stopped at Portland, about 100 miles upriver. This decision was a turning point. Portland, already well-positioned at the confluence of the Columbia and Willamette rivers, became the region's primary transportation hub. The city quickly grew, benefiting from both river and rail trade. Astoria, meanwhile, was left isolated. Without the railroad, it struggled to attract businesses, settlers, and investment. Portland's rise was fueled not just by the railroad, but also by its proximity to the fertile Willamette Valley. This region, with its rich volcanic soil and mild climate, became one of the most productive agricultural areas in the United States. Crops like wheat and fruit flowed through Portland's ports, turning it into an economic powerhouse. Seattle's story, on the other hand, was driven by its deep-water harbor on Puget Sound. Unlike the hazardous Columbia River Bar, Seattle's port was safe and accessible year-round. The city also capitalized on the Klondike gold rush in the 1890s, becoming a key supply hub for prospectors heading to Alaska. By the early 20th century, Seattle was diversifying its economy, with industries like shipbuilding and aerospace laying the groundwork for future growth. Astoria, in contrast, remained dependent on fishing, logging, and canning, industries that faced decline due to overfishing, environmental regulations, and automation. As if Astoria hadn't faced enough challenges, disaster struck in 1922. A massive fire swept through the city's downtown, destroying businesses, homes, and infrastructure. Rebuilding was slow, and by then, Astoria's momentum was gone. Meanwhile, Portland and Seattle were firmly established as the Pacific Northwest's economic and cultural centers. They had the infrastructure, the industries, and the populations to thrive in the 20th century. Astoria became a quiet coastal town, a shadow of what it might have been. Today, it's almost impossible to imagine a world where Astoria is the dominant city of the Pacific Northwest. Seattle boasts a population of over 4 million. Portland has 2.5 million, and Astoria, just 10,000. But history is full of twists and turns. If the Columbia River Bar had been less dangerous, if the railroad had reached the coast, or if the Great Fire had never happened, the story might have been different. Astoria remains a charming town with a rich history, a reminder of the ambitions and challenges that shaped the Pacific Northwest. It's a story of what could have been, and it makes you wonder, how many other almost cities are hidden in history?